This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. We're going to be checking out some more of the late Maureen Heaton's unpublished but very classic manuscript called The Impossible Dream. It comes highly recommended from the Iserbeets, Charlotte Iserbeet and her son Sam, who knew Maureen Heaton. This is Chapter 6. It was the market crash of 1929, which prepared the way for the syndrome of centralized planning in the United States. Over 100 years of ivory tower theory, with more than a quarter century of that time spent in practical field testing, were brought to a critical point on that fateful day in October. Was it planned that way? There were some who thought so even then, and their number has increased in the eventful years since. For it was then that the chorus began. With government controls, the planners chanted, such a crash wouldn't have been possible. A great many Americans felt the impact of that crash, and some listened to the siren song of planning by government. The years of depression which followed the crash touched nearly every family in the nation, one way or another. Was that planned too? Some thought so then, and more think so today. The long years of continuing deprivation and government efforts to correct the problems softened the strong spirit of independence which had characterized the American citizenry. Loss of that spirit made acceptance of the fallacy of central planning possible. Opposition to the controls which must accompany planning by government is always characterized as opposition to planning. Not so. What is at issue is not planning per se, and never has been. Everyone plans every day of their lives. It is who is to do the planning, and for what purpose that is of concern. Just as, in those early days, some citizens recognized that the New Deal was not a square deal, so today there are those who recognize that centralized controls do not prohibit debacles, such as the crash of '29. Some even recognize that, with government controls, such situations can be created to further hidden ends. Occasionally there is proof that a created crisis exists. Usually that proof has to be collected laboriously through long, arduous hours of research. Seldom is there a readily available public record which openly states that a particular event was staged for a specific purpose, or that some project has deeper meaning than its surface appearance would indicate. Rarely is there overt evidence of a deliberate, calculated scheme by government officials to deny citizens their rights under the Constitution. In the case of the gas quote-unquote crisis of the 1970s, there is such evidence. In the summer of 1978, James Schlesinger, Federal Energy Czar, ordered a guide prepared by his department to be, quote, available for use if needed this winter, unquote. Purportedly to develop means of alleviating energy-related disruptions ranging from, quote, power blackouts to another coal strike, unquote. The draft of the guide spelled out the real intent for the Energy Department. Quote, to stage fake emergencies around the country in the next 3 years as a drill to gauge preparedness, unquote. Openly stated intent of the created crises included a 4-day work week, government determination of the hours businesses could operate, and diversion of the vast amounts of electricity used in producing nuclear reactor fuels to civilian use. The draft states, quote, "Throughout the exercises, no participant will have advanced knowledge of the scenarios or of the mock emergencies to be used. One has to wonder about 3 Mile Island in the light of this information. One wonders as well at the fuel, quote-unquote, emergency, which prompted frantic scurrying around by motorists to find a station open, pumping gas, and long lines of cars with frustrated owners resenting the wasted hours." The first of the announced objectives was put into effect almost immediately. With the accelerating promotion of 1313's quote-unquote business improvement areas, or BIAs, since the mid-70s, government control of the hours businesses may operate has become a standard pressure area. Other recommendations in the guide were held in abeyance, awaiting further developments. The draft of the guide, which was made available to the press, was reported in the New York Times on the 24th of November, 1978, right after its release. But both the article and its headline seemed so innocuous that the admission of creation of crisis in the body of the report all but escaped notice. Absent any evidence or suspicion that officialdom would deliberately experiment with the lives and security of its citizens in this fashion, the statement of intent which was included was easily overlooked. At the time I first reported on this incident in June 1979, there had been a number of puzzling aspects to the oil situation. Strange things were going on in oil production, both here, in the United States, as regards government intervention in new well starts, offshore drilling, and the Alaskan pipeline, and in the Middle East. It was 2 years later, before all these began to take form. In 1981, a courageous man who'd been chaplain to workers on the Alaskan pipeline service wrote a book about what he knew about the quote-unquote crisis. Lindsey Williams' book should have caused a stir greater than Watergate. It didn't. The question must be asked, why not? The use in the guide of the terms quote-unquote scenario and quote-unquote exercises is deeply concerning, for the former is an element of the management and control system, or PPBS. With no other identified function in government, while quote-unquote exercises describes the activation of a PPB scenario. Exercises is a term also applied to military maneuvers, both in training war games and as real battle is enjoined. Is it fair to assess such actions by a government department as an attack, not just on the sovereign citizens, but on the foundations of the government itself as a consequence? Is it safe to assume otherwise? Chapter 7. Socialism or Empire. Quote, "There is an undercurrent of political thought in the United States today which drifts toward socialism, and this unconscious drift leads up to a grant of power to our executive department, quite necessary under a socialist government, but which creates a danger to our institutions. Successive grants of power to an executive have always ended in empire with republics of the past. And usually the additional power has been given at the instance of the quote-unquote common people." Unquote. That was a quote from Colonel Ed F. Brown. For many years, the identity of the author of, quote, Socialism or Empire, unquote, has been sought in vain. It may well be that the author used a pseudonym, for the name of Colonel Ed F. Brown seems to have been blotted from history, except as it appears on this rare volume. This writer has long since discounted the need to prove a source, if the information provided can be validated. It is so with this book. With the above quotation, quote-unquote, Colonel Brown, begins the introduction to a most remarkable account of a very serious matter. If the above quote sounds as though it could have been from one of the current crop of polemics about the problems facing America today, be advised that at least half of this book gives the same eerie feeling. Eerie because it was actually published in 1906. Colonel Brown's thesis has to do with the beginnings of the movement to destroy the liberty of the American people to move freely by means of government control of transportation. Present efforts to obtain citizen support for grants of quote-unquote free money from the federales for construction of roads and scenic highways make it imperative that facts be made known before the inevitable extension of power to the federal executive is fully achieved. As Colonel Brown begins to unfold his narrative exposure of the wheels within wheels, which were beginning to turn America empire-ward in 1906, it is difficult to fathom how the trickery was seen and recognized so long ago, and that its effect on the lives and thinking of Americans could be so accurately described before there was any real impact. Given that circumstance, it is also difficult to understand why the federal takeover of the railroads was allowed to continue. Even though then-current events are now history, and dictionary and encyclopedic definitions have been altered, the points Colonel Brown made are still valid and significant today. Even the title of his book has significance: Socialism or Empire. The book is one of the early books which pinpointed the real dangers to American liberty through altered concept. This is demonstrable by comparing the meaning of the word empire then versus now. As defined in dictionaries of that time, empire meant, quote, supreme power in governing, dominion, sovereignty, unquote. Dominion was defined as, quote, the right of uncontrolled possession, use and disposal of supreme authority, the power of governing and controlling, unquote. Sovereign was defined as, quote, supreme in power, not subject to any other. In today's dictionaries, empire is defined as, quote, a major political unit having a territory of great extent, unquote. Dominion has become, quote, a self-governing nation of the British Commonwealth. Wow, that's a big change. And sovereign alone still retains its original concept. This last is seldom used today, except in reference to the quote-unquote sovereign citizen. And there is a reason for that. It is intended that Americans should continue to believe themselves the ultimate power in this country, as recognized by the Constitution, no matter how much of their inherent power they have given away, or delegated, or have had usurped. No matter that common sense and history shows that you can never have your cake and eat it too, we are to continue to believe that our destiny is still in our hands until some unhappy day when we are forced to recognize that the threads of control have become bands of steel, raw power, immutable to resistance. But Colonel Brown saw, back in 1906, that there was, even then, an assault being made on the American people and system. An assault so total that, as we suspect, those who tried to warn of it had to resort to quote-unquote fictional accounts of its existence, or use false identity to plead their case, as we believe was done by quote-unquote Colonel Brown. While the central theme of his book is the issue of quote-unquote government takeover of mass methods of transportation, his description of his fellow citizens as being, quote, so absorbed in business pursuits or busy with their own affairs that they pay little attention to public matters, unquote. This is still an harmonic theme which is still true today. Brown's delving into the socio-political situation, his references to our form of government, his choice of examples to illustrate his points, his careful reporting of events, and his exposure of the power seekers who were then responsible for the assaults he describes, all have meaning for today. Most significant, perhaps, is that he looks ahead, down the corridor of time, and warns against the inevitable result of such tinkering with the basic principles of self-government and or toying with the mental processes of American citizens. That this book never received the attention it merited is a tragedy. If the lessons Colonel Brown tried to impart are not taken seriously today, there is no question that it will not take another 80 years to make them academic. Chapter 8. The Gas Crunch. Time was when, quote-unquote, conspiracy was a word only a quote-unquote right-wing extremist would use to suggest the cause of a world convulsed in turmoil. Few saw that turmoil as a result of a planned assault on existing institutions. No more. In the late 1970s, versions of conspiracy began to be heard on all sides, pouring from the mass media as well as from ordinary folk, as the quote-unquote gas crunch squeezed everyone. Only the oil moguls and the resident of the White House and his minions and bosses proclaimed this quote-unquote crisis to be the result of events which, quote-unquote, just happened. Most opinion seemed to center around the idea that the quote-unquote shortage was arranged by the oil companies just to get higher prices. This is unrealistic. The same people who stood to gain monetarily through this ploy have been playing for higher stakes for years. While attention was directed to what the gas crunch was doing for Mr. Big, almost none was given to what it was doing to Mr. Small. For many years there has been an apparent attempt to herd the citizens of this country into urban centers. The stated reason has been that it is easier and more efficient to provide services such as utilities for a compact area. Parentheses. This ignores the historic role of government in that this is a basic function for which governments exist. End parentheses. Those with a, quote, conspiratorial view of history, unquote, contended that it would be also much easier and more proficient to control the population. Naturally, such people also believed that there was an intent to do just that. That there was reason for that belief was never given credence by those who refused to accept that a plan with an identified goal exists. Despite the skeptics, there is strong evidence to support such a belief. Early evidence was mainly limited to statements of quote-unquote radicals, who, of course, could never carry out such a scheme. Later, the efforts of the planners to surround the cities with quote-unquote green belts, park-like areas where no buildings would mar the scenic beauty, exposed further intent. Ecology freaks supported the planners, but it was still too difficult then to ignore the demands of the owners of the property designated to remain virgin, so green belts were soft-pedaled for a time. Emphasis was placed instead on gaining acceptance of the planning idea by gradually increasing controls across the board, a little here, more there, and, like the threads of Lilliput, the controls eventually became ties that bind. A landmark case in the Los Angeles area involved the Walter O'Malley Stadium. In my mind's eye, I can still see the TV reports of the removal of the last resistor to try to hold her property there, a fragile, very old Mexican-American woman whose family had owned that piece of land since the Hidalgo contract, being carried boldly, bodily, from her home by a huge, burly enforcer, her thin arms and legs flailing in protest, while the bulldozers panted in the background. The giveaway of that land for a ballpark set a precedent, and was later used by collaborating state legislators to pass bills to take over private rights in property by quote-unquote law. The Leslie Salt people made a stand to retain use of their salt flats in the San Francisco area, but were overridden by creation of ABAG, the Regional Association of Bay Area Governments. Tahoe was taken over by legislative action, and the people there not only lost property rights, but representation as well. Piece by piece, the planners worked the old baloney trick. They took slice after slice of property rights, until now there is little left worth struggling to preserve. Some property owners still continue to fight, however, as the strategies being used to achieve this objective become more insistent. As witness, with the eager cooperation of quote-unquote conservative California Governor Ronald Reagan, the planners made their big bid to establish that the Land Use Planning, LUP, scheme as government policy, using California as a test area. A prestigious task force was created and given the monumental assignment of restructuring local government to meet the quote-unquote need for the new role of urban areas. The governor called it his dream, but not the impossible dream. But it was. After holding hearings all around the state to increasingly hostile groups of citizens and local officials, the shambles of the governor's dream had to be dropped back in his lap, with the task force pronouncement that it was not only not wanted, it was not needed. But the planners never give up. Newly elected Governor Jerry Brown lost no time in offering Reagan's dream as his own. But he was more honest and called it a strategy. He boldly backed this fresh attack of property rights with all the power of the governor's office. Brown's strategy came right out and drew a physical boundary around existing urban areas, demanded infilling, i.e., building on existing parcels of bare land, in the cities before granting permits for use of land outside the perimeters, establishing policy for state takeover of private property which did not meet strategy standards, provided for state determination of allowable population growth, and a whole series of similar usurpations. The strategy called for 46 new laws, 2 amendments to the state constitution, and an executive order by the governor to make it legal. But Brown ran into the buzzsaw which woke Reagan from his dream, and his scheme was quickly taken underground. Some bills were quietly passed in short order. Others waited for an opportune time, quietly proceeding to make the strategy legal, despite widespread opposition. So then came the quote-unquote gas crunch. Would it succeed where more direct measures failed? With a fuel shortage, who would want to live any distance from the city, where the jobs and retail outlets were? If there were a possibility that transportation would fall short of the need, no doubt about it, one way or another, the planners expect to obtain this kind of control, and they never give up. No, they never give up. In late 1987, Willie Brown, Speaker of the California Assembly, no relation to Jerry, issued a call for the same dream, announcing that he had a whole package of legislation for it, and demanding that the incumbent governor create a task force to lead the way. As this is being written, the pressure is still on to achieve this objective. When the public can no longer drive their cars or enjoy the remnants of public transportation, 2 elements which made possible the good life Americans have known, will the public quietly sit back then and let the noose be slipped over their heads? When the long gray highways are empty and the bright cars which once flashed over them sit idly in yard, garage, or junk heap, will Reagan's dream and Brown's strategy and Willie's power have the final say? Chapter 9. The Little Green Bus. While our government's interest in how people get from place to place really had its beginnings back in 1887, as Colonel Brown's book demonstrated, solid evidence of that interest as a threat to individual citizens came after World War II. There had been warnings such as government interference with the railroad companies, but that came at the time of the great trust buster, Teddy Roosevelt, and it was made to appear to be, quote, in the public interest, unquote. Continuing assaults gradually created the impression that, quote, the railroad interests, unquote, were at odds with, quote, the public good, unquote. The error in such thought becomes clearer as the public good suffers increasingly from government bungling in matters where it has no right to intervene. A silent witness, the shining steel tracks which opened this country to progress, now lie covered with dust, rust, and weeds, and the government-operated Amtrak flounders, even as government prepares to take over or control all transportation. The danger signals have been raised for years, and logic shows why. A case in point involves a quote-unquote bedroom town in the Los Angeles area. On a map, the outline of the town resembles an hourglass. The pinched center was sparsely populated, and the one bus company in the area refused to service that section on the premise that it was economically unfeasible. Instead, its route went from the top bulge through an adjoining city and back into the lower bulge, leaving the residents in the middle without transportation. Other than Shank's mare, for most of them didn't own cars. Or the one they did own was used to take the breadwinner to work. A couple of young World War II veterans who lived in that area had a different idea. They pooled their resources, obtained a temporary permit, bought a little old bus, repaired it, painted it green, and started rolling. Forbidden by law to compete with the other line, they traversed only the quote-unquote unfeasible route. Yet, they provided such outstanding, dependable, and courteous service that, before long, people who formerly had used the other bus now walked out of their way to take the, quote, little green bus, unquote. And the people who lived along their route were more than happy to find the venture doing so well. When it came time for renewal of the license for the little green bus, however, the other line threw all their weight into opposing even that, let alone a permanent grant of use. I lived there at the time, and the little green bus was a godsend. We were on a hill, and there were no stores at all up there. With two little boys, one in a carriage at first, and then in a tailor tot, to bundle up and take with me, just shopping for groceries was a major project. Going down was not so bad, but coming back up the hill, with the added weight of the purchases, and the boys, was something else. So the little green bus made a real difference. Then, one day, the driver told me that its days were numbered. When I asked him what he meant, he said that it looked like the permit might not be renewed. He told me that the only hope was for the people who used the bus to appear at the city council meeting and try to convince the council that it was needed. That was my first attendance at a government meeting, and it changed my life. I couldn't believe what went on. It was Alice in Wonderland, and made nonsense. Though the routes were not conflicting, the difference in service was notable, as the people testified, and the other line had suffered a measurable loss of patronage. Government sided with the original company, and the little green bus was no more. While this was going on, other signposts were visible in other areas. In Southern California, for instance, the historic electric cars, which for half a century had effectively transported citizens from Long Beach to the San Fernando Valley, and from the South Bay to Pasadena, Azusa, and over to Cucamonga, were being phased out through government pressure. The time came when, and she puts government in quotes there, the time came when citizens were forced to buy automobiles, there you go, whether or not they could afford them, just to get back and forth to work, or any place else for that matter. There were not enough buses, and the routes that quote-unquote government set for them did not cover the need. Two-car families became a commonplace. The streets were choked morning and night with commuters, and Los Angeles and environs also choked on exhaust fumes. So, quote-unquote, government stepped in to relieve the problem. Immediately, backyard incinerators were outlawed, although no case was ever proved against them. Parentheses. And that started another problem, but that's a different story, end parentheses. Freeways mushroomed everywhere overnight, it seemed. As the population increased, more freeways were constructed, and more controls were placed on people. The solutions, quote-unquote, were obsolete before the ink was dry on the regulations. Quote-unquote planning became the war cry of quote-unquote government. But it seemed that the more quote-unquote government planned, the less effective were the quote-unquote solutions. To solve this problem, the harassed users of, quote, the longest parking lot in the world, unquote, were offered the boon of an express lane as a precious jewel, to reward those who could find two riders living near them with a proximate destination and who didn't mind sharing their car with strangers. Today, quote-unquote, diamond lanes have sprung up around every major city in the country. What a blessing carpools can be, to have the joy of speeding past all those clods. Who couldn't or wouldn't, quote-unquote, share the ride? As they inhale the fumes of exhaust from all the other loners, as well as from the cars in the diamond lanes, those clods can listen on the radio to the seductive tones of, quote-unquote, government, calling them to, quote, come ride on the RTD with us, unquote. It would seem that someday, somehow, somewhere, someone in authority would really look at the substance of this problem and decide that those giants of men who built the government under which this nation prospered and grew for so long had something when they denied the use of regulatory agencies such as had brought revolution to these shores so long ago. Perhaps then someone with authority to do something might notice that the revolution which resulted in formation of these United States is being betrayed by the, quote, new American Revolution, unquote, going on now. It can also be hoped that someday, somehow, the people can be brought to recognize that those to whom they have given their trust are causing this travail, either by what they are doing or by failing to do what they should. Chapter 10. No Need to Know? People ask, quote, why spend so much time dwelling on the past? We all saw what happened. We allowed what happened. It's cut off here. We allowed what happened. Better to do something about it than always to be digging up all this old stuff that nobody needs to know, unquote. As we said up front, everybody does not know what went before. If anything constructive is to be done about the problems of today, this old stuff is vital. If this revolution is to be reversed, the counter-revolutionaries, those Americans who care enough to do something about it, must have knowledge of the strategies and tactics being used to achieve the revolutionary goal. The revolutionary goal. This is the eighth principle of warfare. In the military, it's called intelligence. Take the matter of, quote-unquote, humanitarian aid to the so-called Contras. This whole page is cut off the last couple of letters here, so bear with me. Would there be a difference in the public opinion polls if the American people were told in the quote-unquote news broadcasts, parentheses, which is the source from which most people get their information or intelligence, end parentheses, that this has been a successful revolutionary strategy since the loss of China to the free world? How many of you reading this know that it was Dean Acheson who developed this scheme, or at least put it in motion? Acheson and his assistant of Far East Policy, Owen Lattimore, were part of the China lobby, which used this same policy to permit China to go under communist control. Lattimore was later identified by the Senate Committee of Internal Affairs as, quote, a conscious, articulate agent of the Communist Party. It was Secretary of State Acheson who went before a committee of Congress months before the communist hordes swarmed down into Korea and made an impassioned plea for economic aid to, quote-unquote, contain communism in the ill-starred nation. He did not seek or want military aid, even in face of the known threat of invasion there. He specified only, quote, economic aid, unquote, as it was called then, which some in Congress charged would only be to whet the appetite of the Reds in the North. Syngman Rhee, Korea's then president and a staunch ally of the United States, was begging for military help, and Congress saw the merit in his position. They repudiated the State Department scheme and appropriated millions for Korean defense, only to learn much later, after the invasion, that a mere $200 had been spent for military aid, and that even the something purchased with that never arrived in Korea. Sorry folks, it's cut off. The next page is better. The story was the same in China, the Shahs, Iran, Vietnam, Cambodia, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Billions of American dollars sent tons of quote-unquote humanitarian aid to each of these countries, just in time to have the material appropriated to the benefit of the communist successors. Wow. The devastating debacle of the rout in Vietnam was a repeat of the tragedy of the Korean nightmare. The hostage situation in Iran is directly traceable to the same indefensible ploy. The record shows that the consistent position of the strategic activists in control of United States foreign policy has been firmly rooted in clouds of wishful thinking directly related to their impossible dream, a new world order, rather than on historic truths, scientific probabilities, or military necessity. When a nation is under attack and in mortal danger, there is no any aid other than that which can be used for defense or assault the endangered people. The dead hand of Atchison now reaches out to fatten the goose of Central America. Whew, okay, other page, next page, and thankfully I have an entire page to work with. Atchison for the communists, just as it did live in China and Korea and Vietnam. Could this happen again if Congress and the people knew that this strategy was at the heart of the loss of China and those two quote-unquote police actions? If the American people knew, would they rise in righteous anger and forbid their representatives to send flood money to these present-day Genghis Khans? Would they demand action more likely to be in the real interest of the United States and its allies? Knowledge such as this is basic to truly corrective action. At least one United States senator recognized this as he took the floor of the upper house on the 19th of May, 1954, on a special order to discuss what he described as, quote, a devastating situation which disturbs me deeply. The outcome may well decree the death or ensure the life of our free civilization, unquote. Assisted by a young attorney loaned to him for this purpose by the Senate Permanent Investigating Subcommittee, the senator proceeded to present background information for a discussion of what was then called the Cold War. The special order had been triggered by a public announcement from the office of the Vice President that American young men might have to be sent to fight in Indochina. The senator spoke of the incredible policies being utilized in Far East relations and outlined known Soviet aims in that part of the world. The battle for Indochina, he warned, would ultimately determine the control of the entire Pacific, and he cited Soviet policy and goals to confirm the cause for his concern. The senator went on to describe the incredible policy which permitted the United States to ship crucial materiel to communist bloc nations, despite the knowledge that they, in turn, were supplying the war machine of Red China, which also, in turn, was supplying the war capability of both North Korea and North Vietnam. He spoke of the equally incredible policy of permitting aid from these communist satellites to arrive in red Chinese ports on ships carrying the flags of our allies, who were actually receiving aid from the U.S. at that time. He revealed the unbelievable policy of our State Department, which required that the wars in Korea and Vietnam be fought only on the territories of the nations we supposedly were befriending, and never taken beyond their borders into enemy territory, thus laying waste the country that we were quote-unquote helping, and protecting the enemy's war-making capability. The senator wound up his lengthy colloquy with this, quote, "The point I wish to make is this, that we must not even remotely think of sending American boys to the jungles of Indochina while we are financing the shipment of guns which will kill those young men after they get there," unquote. If that speech by that senator had made headlines in the next morning's newspapers, 53,000 young Americans might not have lost their lives in the jungles of Vietnam. Uncounted thousands of other Americans might not have had to face a bleak future, maimed in mind or body, or both, or forever burdened with grief for the loss of loved ones. And many young Americans would not have had to flee their native land to avoid that tragedy for themselves. The vice president in 1954 was Richard Milhouse Nixon. The young attorney was Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy. The concerned senator was Joseph Raymond McCarthy. Two of these men were in positions of power 10 years later, when they could have reissued this warning as American boys were deployed for Vietnam, and they did not. The third died trying, long before a whole generation of Americans were sent to fight and die under those conditions, which still existed 10 years after being exposed and still exist today. No need to know? How can such policies be changed if no one knows about them? It was just such policies which caused even an old soldier like General Douglas MacArthur to testify in Congress, quote, "I have seen, I guess, as much blood and disaster as any living man, but this just curdled my stomach. After I looked at those thousands of women and children and everything, I vomited. Are you, Congress, going to let that go on? Once more, I repeat, what is the policy in Korea?" Unquote. MacArthur didn't live to see Vietnam, much less Nicaragua. Nor is there a record of his ever learning of an article written by Owen Lattimore in which that quote-unquote expert on Far East policy disclosed that the State Department's big problem was, quote, how to allow China to fall to the communists without having it appear that we pushed her, unquote. Oh, man. In discussing Korea in that article, this State Department mole wrote, quote, "The thing to do, therefore, is to let South Korea fall, but not let it look as though we pushed it," unquote. MacArthur and McCarthy are in their graves, and Lattimore and Atchison are long gone from their positions of power, but the evil they did continues to plague the world. This could be due, in part, to the continuing presence in the labyrinthine State Department of many hidden persuaders holding the same views they held. A much larger part of the problem lies in the fact that there can be no correction of such situations, the existence of which is not known. No need to know? Gentle reader, the past is prologue. Okay, that was chapters 6 through 10 of the late Maureen Heaton's book, The Impossible Dream.